Boston, 1849. The year itself was heavy with omens, and the city's cobblestone streets carried the sound of hooves, wagon wheels, and muffled morning songs. Newspapers spoke of progress, of railroads carving new veins into the nation. But the undertakers were busier than the merchants. In that backdrop of contradiction, ambition flourishing even as fever stalked the alleys, there emerged a story, whispered in parlors and written, faintly, in the margins of burial ledgers. The Calder family's ring. A simple gold band forged with no visible flaw, yet remembered less for the weddings it blessed than for the funerals it adorned. The account begins not with joy, but with silence. The silence that follows when a bride's coffin is lowered before her bouquet has even dried. It was said that the same ring slipped from one Calder finger to another, never long resting on the living. What should have symbolized fidelity instead became a recurring witness to death. In a city that valued propriety above all, neighbors began lowering their voices when the family's name was mentioned. A household once admired for trade and piety found itself regarded with the nervous caution reserved for contagion. This is not a tale of horror in the grotesque sense, nor a tale invented for sensation. It is drawn from fragments, archival notes, physicians' diaries, and clippings too cautious to print the full suspicion. It is a case where the artifacts are sparse, but their silences speak as loudly as their ink. The ring is not here to frighten, but to illuminate how grief, repetition, and rumor can reshape an object into something larger than gold. It forces us to confront a question. Do objects inherit the sorrow of those who wear them? Or is it we who attach the weight of memory until it crushes us? Before we continue deeper, an acknowledgement must be made. What follows is a dramatization built from genuine 19th century records and careful reconstruction. Some voices come directly from the archives. Others are reconstructed to illustrate the climate of the time. No harm will be detailed in explicit manner, but death, illness, and despair cannot be avoided in telling this history. Listener discretion is advised. And so we begin, with the claim that one family heirloom passed through more coffins than bridal altars, and in so doing marked the Calder family, as both devout citizens of Boston and prisoners, of a pattern no one could quite name. The ring glinted at the heart of their lineage, a symbol meant for union that became instead a chronicle of separation. In stories like this one, there is always a moment when the past stretches out its hand and asks something of us in the present. The Calder family lived and died long before any of us, yet the silence they left behind feels strangely familiar. Almost every household, whether in Boston of the 1840s or in our world today, keeps some token, an heirloom tucked in a drawer, a photograph framed in faded wood, a ring that has passed from finger to finger. These objects are meant to reassure us that memory endures, that love can be held in metal or cloth. But sometimes those same heirlooms carry burdens we did not choose. A war medal from a life cut short, a Bible annotated by hands that shook with grief, or in the case of the Calders, a wedding ring that seemed to escort its wearers to the grave. This is where I want to pause and turn to you directly. Where are you listening from? And what objects rest in your family's keeping? Do they comfort you, or do they unsettle you when you consider the generations of hands they've passed through? The Calder ring forces us to consider whether our relics carry only love, or whether they sometimes carry sorrow too. Sharing your own reflections keeps these histories alive, and it binds us together across centuries, across oceans, across the silences between archival lines. It is important to underline the contrast at the heart of this account. To the Calders themselves, the ring was not simply a token of romance. It was meant as proof of continuity, the passage of a name from father to son, of trust from husband to wife. Yet in the eyes of neighbors, the same band of gold became a cipher of death. What to one family was a private heirloom became, to the larger community, a public omen. The ring existed in two worlds at once. Inside the family's guarded walls, it was defended as a symbol of fidelity. Outside, whispered through the narrow lanes of Boston, it was treated as something that brought shadow instead of light. By beginning with this question, what does your family keep? And what stories cling to it? We open a space to measure our own traditions against theirs. The Calder story is not only about their loss, but about how we choose to interpret the objects that remain after loss. The city recorded their burials, the church tallied their contributions, and the newspapers recorded their social standing. But what endured longest was the rumor surrounding that thin circle of gold. A rumor that still echoes when we ask ourselves, do our own keepsakes carry only memory, or something heavier, something we cannot name? The year 1849 pressed down upon Boston with a peculiar weight, a season where the city seemed caught between its aspirations and its afflictions. From the hilltops one could see a skyline, pricked with church steeples and the rising chimneys of industry. But down in the alleys, the stench of waste and sickness lingered. Cholera had carved its path through crowded neighborhoods only a few years before, and though the worst waves had ebbed, fear had not. Every cough, every pallid face on the streetcar, carried with it the reminder that death was not reserved for the poor or the careless. It stalked even the drawing rooms of respectable families. For the wealthy, there was always the claim that refinement could shield them. Clean linens, imported medicines, private doctors, but contagion observed no social boundary. Boston was a city of arrivals in that decade. Ships from Ireland emptied their passengers onto the wharves. Families fleeing famine with little more than faith and labor to sustain them. The established Yankee elite looked upon these newcomers with suspicion, blaming them for disease and disorder, yet they were willing to employ them in their kitchens, mills, and docks. The contrast was stark. In Beacon Hill, gas lamps gleamed in polished windows, while only a few streets away, entire families crowded into single rooms, hungry, exhausted, and vulnerable to illness. In this divided landscape, whispers of curses and bad luck found fertile ground. When misfortune struck a prominent household like the Calders, it was never interpreted as chance alone. The Calder name carried weight in mercantile circles. Their ships had moved textiles, timber, and molasses for decades, and the family pew at Old South Church was a fixture. Respectability was as much their inheritance as their wealth. And in 1849, Boston, respectability was currency, but respectability could also become fragile, dissolving the moment tragedy struck too frequently. In a society where disease was expected yet still feared, repeated loss within a single family could not easily be explained away. Neighbors whispered of weak bloodlines, divine judgment, or more dangerously still, objects that carried ill fortune. The Calder wedding ring, passed from one afflicted bride to another, fit neatly into that cultural imagination. This was also a city perched between two modes of thought. On the one hand, science was gathering momentum. Doctors debated theories of contagion. Chemists tested water for unseen toxins. Alienists began cataloging maladies of the mind. On the other hand, faith in providence remained strong, and many still read disaster as the handwriting of God. Families prayed as fervently as they purchased medicines. And so Boston in 1849 was both sanctuary and laboratory. Its churches promised meaning. Its physicians promised progress. Yet neither could always shield its citizens from sudden loss. It is within this environment, a city divided by wealth, belief, and survival, that the Calder tragedies unfolded. Their story cannot be divorced from the cobblestones their carriages rolled over, or the sermons that echoed from pulpits each Sunday, or the shadow of fever that made every wedding a gamble. To understand the Calder ring is to understand the Boston that gave it context. A place where progress and superstition lived side by side, and where one family's misfortunes became the talk of a city already primed to see patterns in sorrow. The Calder household stood in a narrow but dignified stretch of Boston's South End, its brick facade unremarkable at first glance, but its name carried a weight that the structure alone could not convey. The Calders were not newcomers to the city. Their lineage traced back to the earlier part of the century, when Jonathan Calder's father established himself as a reliable trader in lumber and molasses. He was not a magnate of vast fortune, but he was steady, respected, and above all devout. The family rose by increments, their prosperity built less on sudden windfall, and more on the careful accumulation of trust of clients, of church elders, of neighbors. To be a Calder was to be measured, proper, and mindful of reputation. Inside the home, order prevailed. Furniture, while not ostentatious, was sturdy and imported. Rugs bore the muted patterns favored by the devout Calvinists who populated Boston's merchant class. The family Bible, thick and worn, was always within reach, its margins crowded with births, deaths, and verses marked by earlier hands. Meals were disciplined affairs, with prayer before and after, and conversations that often returned to duty, sacrifice, and providence. Even in moments of warmth, there was a kind of restraint, laughter quickly subdued into polite smiles, affection displayed in gestures rather than words. It was a house where love was present, but it was tempered by a belief that worldly comfort was fleeting, and that suffering might itself be a test of faith. The Calder matriarch embodied this ethos with quiet firmness. She instructed her daughters in household management and scripture. her son's diligence and self-control. Her influence ensured that every Calder child grew up with an awareness of two great responsibilities: to uphold the family's good name and to accept whatever trials God placed before them without complaint. This legacy of stoicism, however admirable, also meant that grief was rarely spoken aloud. Sorrows were folded inward, carried silently, becoming a private burden that left no outward scar. The family's position in Bostonian society reflected these traits. They were not so wealthy as to draw envy, but comfortable enough to host neighbors for tea and to appear on charitable committees. Their pew at Old South Church was an anchor, a visible symbol of their standing, their hymns rising alongside those of judges and other merchants. When visitors described the Calders, the words most often used were respectable and upright. Yet, beneath this sheen of respectability lay the vulnerabilities common to any family: daughters whose futures hinged on suitable marriages, sons whose livelihoods depended on fragile trade routes, and a lineage bound tightly to traditions that left little room for change. At the center of these traditions was the wedding ring itself, an heirloom first worn by the patriarch's wife decades earlier, passed carefully into the keeping of each bride. It was regarded as a symbol of continuity, proof that a Calder union was blessed not only by God but by the endurance of family history. To receive the ring was to be folded fully into the family line, to become inseparable from its name and reputation. In an era when marriage was both a sacred vow and a social contract, the ring carried a weight heavier than gold. This heritage, so carefully curated, would soon become the backdrop against which calamity struck. The very qualities that had defined the Calders, their restraint, their faith, their insistence on preserving appearances, would shape how they endured the tragedies to come. For in a household where grief was not voiced, where appearances were guarded, the recurring shadow of death would gather silently, leaving neighbors to wonder and gossip, while the Calders themselves clung ever more tightly to the very heirloom that others had begun to fear. The Calder wedding in the spring of 1849 was, at first, a vision of everything the family had worked to preserve. The church bells rang clearly over the rooftops, their sound mingling with the salt breeze from the harbor, announcing to the city that another Calder union was being sanctified before God. Guests filled the pews, the women in pale silks and gloves, the men in tailored coats, and at the front stood Jonathan Calder, eldest son, groomed not only for marriage, but for eventual leadership of the household's mercantile affairs. At his side, his bride, Margaret Ellis, a young woman from a family of schoolmasters, stood in the subdued grace expected of a respectable Boston wedding. There was no lavish display, no extravagant banquet, but there was pride, a quiet certainty that this day marked the continuation of a lineage anchored in discipline and faith. When the vows were spoken, the minister turned to the groom and signaled the exchange of rings. From a velvet-lined box carried by Jonathan's younger brother came the Calder heirloom, gleaming despite its age. Guests later remarked that Jonathan held the band a moment longer than was customary, as though feeling its weight before sliding it onto Margaret's hand. It was a gesture unnoticed by most in that moment, but preserved in the memory of those who later recounted the day. With the ring in place, the congregation exhaled a collective sigh of approval, believing the family's traditions had once more secured the future. The wedding supper was modest yet cheerful, held in the Calder home. Neighbors spoke of Margaret's soft voice, of her graciousness as she moved among guests. For a brief time, joy held dominion over the household. Yet scarcely 3 weeks later, the mood had shifted. Margaret was confined to her chamber with a fever that defied the attentions of both physician and prayer. Her complexion, once radiant, grew pale and waxen. The physician spoke of a putrid inflammation, a phrase that brought little clarity to those gathered at her bedside. Remedies were attempted, infusions of herbs, poultices, whispered prayers, but nothing steadied her decline. When death came, it came swiftly. The same pews that had witnessed her vows now witnessed her coffin, draped in black cloth. Neighbors who had applauded the new union stood again in solemn silence, remarking on the cruelty of a bride buried before the marriage had even taken root. Most striking, however, was the presence of the ring. Following Calder family custom, it had not been removed from Margaret's hand. Instead, it gleamed faintly as her body was prepared for burial. What had been given as a seal of continuity was now interred as a companion to death. The congregation noted this with unease, but no one spoke it aloud, for to criticize the Calder customs would be to question their respectability. Yet among the whispers that filtered through Boston's parlors and alleys, unease began to take root. A wedding ring was meant to symbolize beginnings, not endings. Yet here it had accompanied a bride into the grave. Was it simply ill fortune? Or did the object itself carry a shadow that could not be ignored? Some suggested it was cruel providence, a test of faith upon a family held in high regard. Others, less charitable, murmured of curses and ill omens. For the Calders themselves, the loss was absorbed with stoic silence. The ring, retrieved before burial, was returned to its place among the family's treasures, waiting for the next ceremony, as though tragedy could be folded into tradition without consequence. For the Calder family, the ledger entry would have been invisible. They did not consult such records in the aftermath of loss. To them, Margaret's passing was absorbed into private mourning. But for us looking back, that tiny mark becomes an early signal that the Calder ring was beginning to draw notice beyond the household. The ledger, meant to affirm order, instead testifies to disorder. The creeping sense that this was not just another death in Boston's long tally, but the start of something more ominous. Jonathan Calder's grief had barely settled into the walls of the family home when his younger brother Samuel stepped into a role both familiar and fraught. In households such as theirs, marriages were not simply matters of affection. They were the threads that secured alliances, reputation, and continuity. Samuel's engagement, announced scarcely a year after Margaret's funeral, was therefore received with relief. It promised to restore momentum to a family line that had faltered under the weight of premature death. His betrothed, Eleanor Price, was the daughter of a shipping agent whose business complemented Calder interests, and her union with Samuel was seen as both practical and promising. The announcement was modest, befitting their shared values. Yet beneath the polite smiles of neighbors, there lingered an unease that no one cared to voice directly. The Calder wedding ring had been retrieved from Margaret's hand before burial, a choice made with quiet resolve. To abandon it would have been to fracture a family tradition too carefully cultivated, and so the ring was polished, blessed once more by the minister, and placed into Samuel's keeping. That detail, harmless in appearance, was enough to stir quiet murmurs among the community. Could a symbol of such recent loss truly preside over another beginning? Preparations moved forward. Eleanor was described as vivacious but devout, a young woman eager to assume her role as wife and mistress of a respectable home. Friends remembered her laughter during sewing circles, her meticulous care in embroidering linens for the marriage bed. Yet as the weeks passed, Eleanor began to complain of a persistent weakness, fatigue, a light fever, headaches that left her unable to attend gatherings. At first, her symptoms were attributed to the anxieties of an approaching wedding, the strain of moving from one household into another. But when she grew paler, her appetite failed, and her vitality seemed to drain away. Concern deepened. Physicians were summoned, though their remedies were the same array of tinctures and poultices that had failed Margaret. Some suspected typhoid, others whispered of nervous exhaustion, a catch-all phrase that explained little. For Samuel, the decline was unbearable. He watched as the future promised to him. The home, the children, the partnership dissolved before his eyes. Eleanor's parents, though polite, could not disguise their own apprehension. To them it was not merely an illness. It was an echo of what had happened only months earlier to another Calder bride. When Eleanor died, just weeks before the wedding ceremony was to be held, the city's whispers sharpened. Unlike Margaret, she had never worn the ring in marriage, but she had accepted it during the private betrothal ritual in the Calder parlor. According to one relative's later account, Eleanor had slipped the band onto her finger in Samuel's presence, promising fidelity even before the church could sanction it. To the Calder family, it was an intimate gesture of trust. To the neighborhood, once the girl was laid in her coffin, it was proof enough that the ring itself carried ill fortune. The funeral was quieter than Margaret's, the congregation more watchful. No ledger mark survives to indicate doubt, but oral accounts passed through neighbors preserved the sense that something uncanny had taken place. Two young women, both tied to the Calders, both linked to the same piece of gold, and both carried to the grave before their marriages could blossom. Coincidence could explain one tragedy. Two, in such quick succession, pressed the limits of rational patience. In the Calder home, silence reigned. Samuel withdrew into himself, and Jonathan, already marked by loss, seemed older than his years. Their mother clung to scripture, repeating verses about trials sent to strengthen the faithful. Yet even within the family's rigid stoicism, questions could not be fully suppressed. Why had the ring, an object meant to sanctify love, become a silent witness to so much loss? And if it had already passed through 2 funerals, what future could it possibly secure? The first candid trace of how the Calder tragedies were spoken of within the family does not come from a pulpit or a physician's log, but from a letter. It was written in a careful but hurried hand, the ink uneven, the language restrained yet heavy with implication. The author was Mary Calder, a cousin residing in Salem, who had attended both Margaret's funeral and, later, the somber rites for Eleanor Price. Her letter, preserved only because it was folded into the back of a family Bible, carried a tone unlike the public words spoken at church or in polite company. Where sermons emphasized divine providence and physicians spoke of fever, Mary allowed herself the liberty of suspicion. She addressed the letter to her sister in Portsmouth, and its opening lines were ordinary enough. News of household health, comments on the weather, inquiries about relatives. But as her words progressed, she turned toward the subject of the Calders in Boston. She described Jonathan's haunted look, Samuel's retreat into silence, the matriarch's insistence on prayer. Then, almost as if the thought had been waiting too long to remain unsaid, she wrote, "There is talk that the ring itself carries an ill omen. For since it has passed from hand to hand, sorrow has followed with strange haste. I do not say I believe this, yet the whisper follows me still, and I cannot lay it aside." The letter is striking for its tension between denial and confession. Mary frames her remark cautiously, as though afraid her words might be judged uncharitable. She insists she does not fully believe, and yet she commits the thought to paper, ensuring its survival beyond idle talk. In that moment, she bridges the space between rumor and record. The ring, no longer only a silent presence in ceremonies and coffins, becomes an object named, discussed, and feared. To read the letter now is to glimpse how private unease began seeping through the seams of family loyalty. Cousins and distant relations, bound by affection, but not by daily proximity, had more freedom to speculate. They were close enough to feel the sting of loss, yet distant enough to whisper what the immediate household could not. The Calders in Boston clung to their traditions, insisting the ring remain in circulation. But those on the margins began to articulate what the central family dared not, that perhaps the object had become tainted, or at the very least, that its symbolism no longer inspired faith but dread. The contrast here is stark. Inside the Calder home, grief was swallowed in stoic silence, reinforced by scripture and social expectation. Beyond its doors, even among kin, grief transformed into speculation, into narrative, into what would later grow into legend. The letter stands as a fragile artifact of that transformation, its ink faded but legible, its words cautious yet bold enough to have survived. In a world where superstition and science overlapped, where providence was invoked as often as medicine, Mary's letter captures the pivot. From sorrow seen as divine test to sorrow seen as a pattern linked to a physical object. And so by the time this letter was written, the Calder ring was no longer simply a family treasure. It had become a character in its own right, a presence invoked in whispers, a subject of uneasy speculation. Though it would remain in the family's possession, its meaning was already shifting, acquiring a darker gravity that the next tragedy would only deepen. The Calder home, once a place of quiet respect admired from afar, had by 1850 become a house that neighbors regarded with a sidelong glance. No one would say outright that the family was cursed. That word was too dangerous, too superstitious for a city striving toward modern refinement. But whispers filled the gaps that silence left behind. 2 young women dead in such rapid succession, both bound in some way to the same piece of gold, was not a sequence that Boston's mercantile community could easily dismiss. And so the story of the Calder ring slipped out of drawing rooms and into alleyways, spreading with the ease of rumor in a city already attuned to fear. In the markets near Dock Square, fishmongers would murmur about that Calder wedding, banned as though speaking its name too loudly might invite misfortune. Servants who worked briefly in the Calder home repeated what they had overheard. Hushed prayers at night, voices sharp with grief behind closed doors, the clink of the ring being handled and returned to its box. These fragments carried into taverns and kitchens expanded into fuller stories. Some swore the ring had been fashioned from Spanish gold seized in dubious trade. Others that it had been pulled from a shipwreck and carried with it the salt of drowned souls. There was no evidence for such tales, but the absence of clear explanation left fertile ground for invention. The whisper network operated along class lines as well. Among the city's elite, the Calder's plight was spoken of in careful veiled terms, at church suppers and charitable meetings. Acquaintances noted their losses with pious expressions, but avoided inviting them into circles where merriment was expected. Respectability demanded that open gossip be suppressed. Yet even within those circles, eyes flickered toward the Calder pew with unease. Among laborers, dockhands, and immigrant communities, the rumors were sharper. To them, the ring was not a moral lesson or divine test, but a cursed object, proof that wealth could not shield a family from darkness. Children absorbed these stories in their own way. In the narrow lanes, games of Calder's ring emerged, where one child would pass a stone to another before feigning collapse, laughter mixing with a strange undercurrent of dread. Parents scolded them, but the game persisted, an echo of how deeply the tale had entered common talk. In such play, the line between entertainment and superstition blurred, preserving the family's sorrow as folklore in the making. The most dangerous aspect of the Whisper Network was not merely the stories themselves, but how they began to shape the family's isolation. Invitations waned. Prospective business partners hesitated. The Calder sons found fewer allies willing to speak openly on their behalf. What had once been a household defined by propriety was now defined by absence. The absence of company at their table, the absence of laughter in their parlor, the absence of the easy trust that once smoothed their dealings. The Calders themselves responded with their characteristic silence, retreating further inward, clinging to the rituals of scripture and the stubborn preservation of the ring. The contrast was plain. Within the Calder household, the ring was still treated as a sacred heirloom, a binding symbol of continuity. Outside, it had become a cipher for calamity, a shorthand in stories told after dark. In that gap between inner devotion and outer suspicion lay the slow unraveling of the Calder reputation. And in Boston, a city that thrived on reputation as much as commerce, such unraveling could be more dangerous than disease itself. By the spring of 1851, the Calder family had already endured more than most households could bear. Yet what followed that year would transform whispers into conviction, for it was not a bride who wore the ring next, but a child. The decision itself was small, almost thoughtless in its execution, born less of superstition than of sentiment. After two women had gone to the grave under its shadow, the ring was not immediately prepared for another wedding. It rested instead in a carved wooden box on the dresser of the Calder matriarch, a token she could not bring herself to abandon. In her grief, she sometimes opened the box, ran her fingers along the band, and spoke quiet prayers, as though asking the object to carry sorrow away instead of deepen it. It was during one such moment of private mourning that the youngest Calder daughter, barely 7 years old, entered her mother's chamber. She was a child full of curiosity, drawn to the sparkle of the ring as children are drawn to any forbidden treasure. To her, the gold band was not yet burdened with the whispers of the city. It was only something bright and beautiful, something that belonged to her family. The girl slipped it over her small finger, giggling at how loose it felt, holding it aloft in the sunlight as though she were playing at being a bride. The mother, watching, allowed it for a moment, perhaps believing that harmless play might soften the object's association with grief. But within a fortnight, the child fell ill. At first, it was a fever, the kind that mothers in Boston had learned to dread but endure. Yet the illness deepened rapidly. Her skin flushed. Her breathing grew shallow, her nights restless with delirium. The physician, by then a familiar presence in the Calder home, prescribed his usual measures, but nothing steadied the decline. Neighbors whispered at the speed of her worsening, comparing it to the swift collapses of Margaret and Eleanor. Though no direct cause could be named, the fact that the child had been seen playing with the ring was enough to fuel the growing sense of inevitability. The funeral was the most devastating of all, not only for the family, but for the community that gathered in the church pews. A bride's death could be explained away as fragile constitution, an unfortunate illness, but a child, innocent and full of promise, struck down after handling the heirloom. It was more than coincidence in the eyes of many. Mothers drew their own children closer, murmuring prayers as they filed past the coffin. Some swore they saw the glint of the ring on a ribbon laid beside the child, a token of remembrance placed there by the grieving mother. Whether or not that detail is true, it became part of the narrative, repeated with quiet certainty in kitchens and alleyways. The Calder ring had claimed a child. This third incident sealed the object's reputation. Even those who had dismissed earlier talk as superstition now spoke cautiously of the family's heirloom. Ministers shifted uneasily in their sermons, careful not to name the Calders directly, but urging their congregations to resist the dangers of idolatry, as though a wedding band might somehow become a snare for the soul. The contrast was sharper than ever. Within the family, the ring remained a link to tradition, guarded fiercely by a mother unwilling to discard it. Outside, it was branded as a thing of contagion, a curse that no prayer seemed able to lift. The child's passing also marked a new stage in the Calder's isolation. Few neighbors came to call afterward, and those who did kept their visits brief. Samuel withdrew further. Jonathan buried himself in trade, and the matriarch clutched her Bible more tightly than ever. Yet the one constant was the ring, still preserved, still defended, even as its presence turned celebration after celebration into mourning. It was at this moment, after the third funeral, after the whispers hardened into collective memory, that the Calder tragedy became something larger than a private grief. It became a pattern, a story retold in markets and pulpits, one that would soon draw the attention of a physician willing to put superstition to the test. The figure who next entered the Calder orbit was Dr. Horace Winthrop, a physician whose reputation in Boston rested not only on his medical skill, but on his zeal for rational inquiry. Winthrop belonged to a younger generation of doctors who sought to distance themselves from the guesswork of old remedies, aligning instead with the city's growing culture of scientific societies and anatomical lectures. Where others might have spoken in hushed tones of curses or omens, he preferred the language of contagion, pathology, and inherited weakness. When word of the Calder family's string of funerals reached him not merely through medical reports but through the gossip that coursed along the docks, he recognized both a mystery to solve and an opportunity to demonstrate that reason could banish superstition. It was not customary for a physician to intrude unbidden upon a grieving household, but Winthrop found a way through mutual acquaintances. A merchant friend of Jonathan Calder introduced him, framing his visit as one of consolation and concern rather than investigation. Once admitted to the home, Winthrop observed with the detached eye of a clinician. He noticed the mother's pallor, the brother's withdrawn demeanors, the heavy drapery that kept rooms in shadow, the faint smell of illness that seemed to linger despite the passing of weeks. His questions were polite, yet deliberate. He asked about patterns of sickness in the household, about foods consumed, about the quality of the water drawn from their well. Most importantly, he inquired after the ring. It is said that Winthrop held it briefly in his hand, weighing the plain band as though it were no different from 100 others. To him, the object itself could not contain malice, yet he entertained the idea that it might carry something unseen, traces of metal impurities, a residue of mercury from the jeweler's craft, or even contagion passed from finger to finger. He did not scoff at the rumors, but neither did he endorse them. Instead, he proposed an examination. If the Calders would permit him to keep the ring for a time, he could submit it to chemical testing at the Massachusetts Medical College, where advances in mineral analysis were becoming more sophisticated. The family's response revealed the fracture within. Samuel, weary of the gossip and desperate for reprieve, urged compliance. The matriarch, however, clutched at her apron and declared that no object belonging to her late daughter should be given over to strangers. Jonathan wavered, caught between filial loyalty and the merchant's instinct to preserve family honor. In the end, a compromise was struck. Winthrop would be allowed to examine the ring within the Calder home, but not remove it. He set about his observations with care. He sketched the ring in his notebook, noting its worn edges, the faint indentations left by years of wear. He compared its weight against his pocket scale, found nothing unusual, then performed a simple test with diluted acid to determine its purity. His notes survive in fragments, but one entry is especially telling. The object bears no trace of alloy save the common proportion. Yet I cannot disregard the sequence of calamities. If not the ring itself, perhaps its circulation among mourners spread some unseen influence. Here in his own words lies the tension of the age. Science pressing against the edges of what it could explain, yet unwilling to dismiss coincidence entirely. Winthrop's methodical approach contrasted sharply with the city's swelling rumor mill. Where neighbors spoke of curses, he sought causes. Where the matriarch saw sacred inheritance, he saw potential contagion. The two frameworks collided in the dim parlor of the Calder home. With the ring resting between them like a challenge, neither could claim fully. His visit did not resolve the matter, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, the Calder misfortunes were not merely the subject of rumor and whispered theology. They had entered the domain of inquiry, where hypotheses could be tested, notes recorded, and perhaps evidence secured. And yet, even as Winthrop left the Calder home with his notebook full, the family's tragedy was not finished. The ring remained where it always had, untouched by acid or explanation, waiting for the next hand to wear it. In the weeks following his visit to the Calder home, Dr. Horace Winthrop began the process of shaping his rough notes into a more formal record. At first, these entries were meant only for his private journal, a leather-bound volume in which he documented unusual cases, experimental trials, and reflections on the shifting boundaries between superstition and science. Yet his Calder observations soon spread further than he may have intended, carried into the hands of colleagues who were eager for material that blurred the line between pathology and folklore. The surviving fragments, preserved in the archives of the Massachusetts Medical College, reveal a curious blend of clinical detachment and hesitant wonder. Winthrop cataloged the sequence of deaths with precision, listing names, ages, and dates of decline. He described the ring itself with the cool eye of a mineralogist. A plain circlet of yellow gold, estimated 22 carats, weight 4 1/8 pennyweight, without ornament save for natural wear. Yet alongside these measurements, he allowed unease to seep in. No alloy of lead or quicksilver detected, though one might expect trace contamination. The pattern of demise persists, not explicable by constitution alone. It is difficult to overstate the importance of these words. For the first time, the Calder misfortunes were not confined to sermons, gossip, or family lore. They had entered the realm of documented inquiry, fixed on paper in the language of science. The journal pages themselves became artifacts, objects that could be cited, studied, and debated. In an era when the professionalization of medicine was still contested, such notes blurred the boundaries of authority. Was Winthrop merely recording coincidence, or was he elevating rumor into evidence? His peers could not agree. A letter preserved in the papers of another physician, Dr. Thomas G. Waterhouse, suggests that Winthrop shared extracts during a gathering of the Boston Society for Medical Improvement. The society, a forum for discussion of unusual cases, prided itself on resisting superstition, yet here was a respected colleague, presenting an account that carried the scent of the uncanny. According to Waterhouse's account, the reactions were mixed. One member dismissed it as household hysteria. Another proposed inherited weakness among the Calder women, while a third speculated that a subtle contagion of the funeral cloths might be responsible. Winthrop himself, the letter records, refused to declare certainty, concluding only that the sequence compels attention. The ripple effects of these discussions reached beyond the society's chamber. Extracts of Winthrop's journal began to circulate in private correspondence, occasionally paraphrased or embellished. One young medical student copied passages into his commonplace book, later annotating in the margin, "Curious case, reminds me of Pliny's tales of enchanted rings." Thus, a 19th century physician's sober attempt at documentation began to acquire the patina of legend, carried from desk to desk until fact and interpretation could no longer be neatly separated. This circulation also hardened the contrast between inside and outside perspectives. Within the Calder household, the ring remained fiercely defended, still wrapped in its role as a token of continuity and devotion. Outside, the very same ring was now being dissected in clinical journals, discussed in lecture halls, and whispered about in taverns as an object of dread. What the family guarded as sacred, others transformed into a case study of affliction. That divergence deepened the Calder's isolation, for their grief was no longer private. It had been appropriated, analyzed, and debated without their consent. The journal itself endures as one of the most haunting artifacts of the case. Its stiff pages preserve the collision of two worlds, the rational empiricism of a doctor unwilling to indulge superstition, and the undeniable shadow cast by 3 funerals tied, however loosely, to a single band of gold. In recording the Calder misfortunes, Winthrop may have hoped to demystify them. Instead, he gave them permanence. By the summer of 1851, the Calder family's grief was no longer theirs alone to endure. What had begun as private sorrow, then as neighborhood whisper, had now become the subject of drawing room speculation and street corner warnings. The reason was simple. Word of Dr. Winthrop's notes had escaped the circle of physicians and begun to trickle into the wider community. It mattered little that the doctor had framed his observations cautiously, hedging his words with scientific restraint. Once repeated by students, clerks, and ministers eager for conversation, his measured phrases transformed into something more sensational. Where he had written, "The sequence compels attention," Boston now repeated, "The doctor says the ring is cursed." For the Calders, this shift was devastating. They had tolerated whispers among neighbors, endured gossip among merchants. But to hear their family, tragedy dissected in public as a medical curiosity, was another wound altogether. Jonathan Calder discovered references to the case during a meeting with trading partners, their voices lowered but their meaning unmistakable. Samuel, who already carried bitterness like a second skin, stormed from church one Sunday after hearing a sermon on objects of temptation, convinced it was a thinly veiled rebuke. Even the matriarch, steadfast in her defense of the ring, wept openly when a visiting cousin suggested, clumsily, perhaps with good intention, that the heirloom be melted down for safety's sake. Outside the family, however, the story had taken on a life of its own. In the taverns near the wharves, sailors embellished it into a seafaring curse, claiming the gold had been dredged from wreckage and carried the wrath of drowned men. Among the city's Irish immigrants, some framed it as divine judgment upon a wealthy Protestant household, a leveling of fortune and suffering. Among Boston's reformist circles, the tragedy was cited as an allegory for the dangers of clinging to tradition at the expense of progress. The ring, once a private symbol of fidelity, had become a canvas on which the city painted its own anxieties and lessons. This widening discourse created a tension that no household could withstand for long. Loyalty to blood and memory on one side, and the corrosive pressure of public scrutiny on the other. The Calder sons could not conduct business without sidelong glances and muttered remarks. The mother could not attend services without feeling the weight of pitying stares. Even children on the street, once playmates, now taunted the surviving Calder daughter with rhymes about the ring that kills. In the midst of this, Winthrop himself faced unease. Though he had not sought publicity, he could not deny that his words had escaped containment. His reputation as a sober-minded physician was suddenly entangled with whispers of curses, a linkage he had hoped to dispel, not inflame. Some colleagues praised him for having dared to document the case. Others criticized him for lending superstition an undeserved platform. His private letters from the time betray his conflict. I fear my words have been seized not as reasoned notes but as fuel for rumor. The family suffers, and I, though not guilty, am yet entangled. Thus the contrast sharpened to a painful clarity. Within the Calder walls, silence and prayer sought to preserve dignity. Outside, stories multiplied, reshaping their grief into entertainment, allegory, or warning. The object at the center, a simple band of gold, was no longer merely worn or preserved. It had become public property in the imagination of the city, an emblem over which neither family nor physician could claim authority. And in that transformation lay the seed of confrontation. A household desperate to defend its honor against a city eager to interpret, condemn, or exploit. The stage was set for a collision between private loyalty and public spectacle, one that no amount of scripture or science could fully contain. The confrontation arrived not as a mob at the door, but as a delegation, 3 men and 1 woman, respected members of the congregation the Calders had long attended. Their visit was announced with the stiff formality of courtesy. A knock at the parlor door, the removal of hats, the clearing of throats. Yet beneath their politeness lay something sharper, the resolve of a community that had grown weary of whispered unease. They came not to comfort but to persuade, and their object was clear. The minister, Reverend Elias Morton, spoke first. He was a man known for his stern countenance and habit of speaking as though the pulpit still framed his words. He began with sympathy, recounting the congregation's prayers for the Calder household, the sorrow felt at each of the funerals. But soon his voice shifted into exhortation, urging them to consider whether the ring, however beloved, had become a stumbling block. Scripture warns us against objects raised above their rightful place, he intoned, and against tokens that ensnare the heart in sorrow. He did not say cursed, but the implication hung heavy. The woman, Mrs. Abigail Clark, offered her own testimony, framed in maternal concern. She spoke of children frightened by the tale of the Calder ring, of families too nervous to visit the house, of the isolation that now defined them. Her words were not hostile, but firm. You must think of what remains, not of what is gone. The ring is only gold, but your name, your children, these may yet be preserved. Jonathan sat rigid, hands clenched in his lap, the merchant's instinct for diplomacy checked by simmering humiliation. Samuel bristled openly, his anger spilling into harsh retorts about gossip, cowardice, and the cruelty of cloaking superstition and piety. The matriarch, however, remained the axis around which the room revolved. She sat with the ring in its wooden box before her fingers resting on its lid as though it were an anchor. When she finally spoke, her words were steady but unyielding. "This ring bound my daughter in joy before sorrow touched her. It is the last thing she held as her own. To destroy it would be to sever her memory. Would you ask a mother to burn her child's Bible? To tear the hem from her wedding dress? No, then do not ask this of me." The delegation pressed harder, their voices rising, citing duty to God, duty to neighbor, even duty to public health. Winthrop's notes had given them license, for they claimed that even science now questioned the safety of the object. But the Calders refused. Samuel rose to his feet, declaring that no hand outside the family would touch the ring. Jonathan, torn but loyal, backed his brother. The matriarch, her voice quavering now, insisted that to give up the heirloom would be to let death conquer memory itself. The meeting ended in stalemate. The visitors departed with stiff bows, murmuring prayers that carried more reproach than comfort. On the threshold, Reverend Morton turned once more, his parting words heavy with warning. Objects kept in defiance of God's will have a way of drawing his judgment. In that moment, the private burden of the Calder family became an open defiance. Their refusal transformed them from pitied sufferers into a household viewed with suspicion, even resentment. Neighbors who once offered condolences now crossed the street, rather than pass their gate. The ring, once whispered about, had become a point of civic contention, an object around which faith, fear, and defiance collided. The contrast was undeniable. What the Calders guarded as sacred remembrance, their community interpreted as dangerous obstinacy, and in that widening gap pressure mounted, setting the stage for escalation beyond words, a test not of persuasion, but of endurance and survival. It was in the dead of night, sometime in late autumn of 1851, that the Calder household first felt the pressure of words turn into action. The evening had passed in its usual gloom, lamplight subdued, scripture read in muted tones. The matriarch retiring early with the wooden box kept close at her bedside. Outside, a cold wind rattled shutters and carried the muffled din of taverns along the wharves. But past midnight, a sound broke the stillness, the sharp splinter of wood, subtle yet unmistakable, echoing through the back corridor near the servants' entrance. Jonathan was the first to stir, a man accustomed to the noises of ships and markets. He knew the difference between a house, creaking in the cold, and a lock, strained by force. He woke Samuel, and together the brothers moved cautiously through the darkened hall, armed with little more than a poker and a lantern. The flicker of flame revealed what their ears had warned them. The back door's latch had been pried. The wood splintered where a tool had pressed. The door had not yet given way, but the intent was clear. Someone outside was trying to enter, and not by invitation. Accounts diverge on what happened next. In the family's retelling, preserved in a surviving deposition given weeks later, the brothers flung open the door and shouted into the night, sending the intruder fleeing. Other sources suggest they caught a glimpse of more than one figure, two, perhaps three shadows melting into the alleyway. Whoever they were, they left behind no name, only the evidence of intrusion and the chilling certainty that the Calder home had been targeted, not for theft of coin or silver, but for the ring that had become infamous across the city. For Samuel, the break-in confirmed his worst suspicions. He had warned that gossip would not stop at words, that the more the city fixated on the ring, the more someone would seek to remove it by force. His anger boiled into action. He insisted that bars be fitted across the doors, that the box containing the ring never be left unattended, that any visitor be regarded with suspicion. Jonathan, though more cautious, agreed to the precautions, yet he mourned the transformation of their home from sanctuary to fortress. The matriarch, for her part, saw the attempted intrusion as a violation of sacred ground. They would rob a grave if they could, she whispered, clutching the box as though it were a relic. The community's response was muted, which only deepened the family's sense of betrayal. Neighbors who surely had heard the commotion professed ignorance. The local watch offered little more than a perfunctory investigation, noting the splintered door but finding no suspects. Behind their indifference lay quiet approval. Many believed the ring should have been surrendered long ago, and if anonymous hands sought to do what the Calders would not, few were eager to interfere. Thus the contrast sharpened yet again. Inside the home, the ring was defended with desperate vigilance, its preservation equated with love, memory, and defiance. Outside, silence reigned, a silence that was itself a form of complicity, the tacit acknowledgement that perhaps the household deserved its siege. The Calders stood alone, their grief weaponized against them, their names slowly curdling into a cautionary tale. The attempted break-in marked a dangerous new phase in the story. The ring was no longer merely a subject of rumor, nor even of persuasion. It had become a contested object in the physical world, something people were willing to risk shame or arrest, to seize or destroy. For the family, the message was inescapable. They were not only isolated but besieged. And from this point onward, every creak in the night, every knock at the door, carried with it the threat of intrusion, of a hand reaching not for coin, but for the circle of gold that had bound their lives to loss. The attempted break-in had unsettled the Calders more than they were willing to admit aloud, and it provided the narrow opening Dr. Horace Winthrop had been waiting for. Within days of hearing whispers of the intrusion, likely from a member of the neighborhood watch who reported more eagerly to physicians than to constables, Winthrop reappeared at the Calder door. This time, he did not come cloaked in the courtesy of a social call. He arrived with his leather satchel, his notebook, and the quiet insistence of a man who believed the matter had crossed the threshold. From private sorrow into public danger, Jonathan met him in the parlor, visibly weary from nights spent pacing the halls. Samuel lingered by the fireplace, arms crossed, his glare fixed upon the visitor with open hostility. The matriarch, pale from sleeplessness, held the wooden box in her lap as though daring anyone to snatch it from her. Winthrop bowed politely, yet his words carried the weight of authority. "Madam, gentlemen, I must speak plainly. What has happened here is no longer contained within these walls. The ring is known, spoken of, feared. Its presence invites trespass, even violence. You have seen this now. I beg you, allow me to remove it from this house, if only for a time, to place it under controlled examination." The reaction was immediate. Samuel exploded, his voice sharp with fury, accusing Winthrop of being the very source of their misery. "It was your damn notes that turned gossip into frenzy," he spat. "You made us a spectacle. Now you would rob us under the guise of science." Jonathan tried to intercede, his merchant's instinct pushing him toward negotiation, but even he bristled at the implication of surrender. The matriarch said nothing at first. She simply rested both hands on the lid of the box, her knuckles pale, her eyes shining with defiance. Winthrop pressed on, his tone firm but not unkind. He admitted that his writings had traveled further than he wished, but insisted the matter was larger than blame. "I cannot undo what has spread," he said, "but I can work to resolve it. If the ring is harmless, my analysis will prove it so. If it bears some hidden contamination, that too can be known. But keeping it here unexamined ensures only that more doors will be splintered, more whispers sharpened." He drew a folded sheet from his satchel, an informal memorandum signed by 2 other physicians, urging the Calders to release the object for scientific review. This was his attempt to wield authority not as one man, but as the voice of Boston's medical establishment. The matriarch's answer was devastating in its simplicity. She lifted the box slightly, as though weighing it, and then whispered, "This is the last piece of my daughter that I can touch. Would you carry her coffin too, doctor, to your laboratory? Would you measure the dust of her bones?" Her words pierced the room, silencing even Samuel's fury for a moment. Winthrop faltered, his clinical logic no match for the raw gravity of maternal grief. The discussion unraveled from there. Samuel threatened violence should the doctor lay a hand on the box. Jonathan, torn and trembling, confessed he saw wisdom in removing the object but could not bring himself to betray his mother's will. Winthrop, realizing he had reached the limits of persuasion, packed his papers and withdrew, leaving behind an atmosphere more fractured than when he entered. This encounter marked the closest the ring ever came to being, surrendered under the banner of reason. The contrasts were painfully clear: science against tradition, civic duty against familial loyalty, rational inquiry against sacred memory. Each side believed itself righteous, yet neither could move the other, and so the ring remained, heavy with its silence, in the Calder home, a symbol of love to those who guarded it, and of danger to those who feared it. The breaking point came in the bitter winter of 1852, when patience among the Calder family's neighbors finally gave way to action. The attempted burglary months earlier had been furtive, the work of shadows. What followed was brazen, fueled not by secrecy but by collective resolve. By then the Calder household had become a symbol in Boston, spoken of in taverns, condemned in sermons, debated in hushed tones at parlors. 3 funerals, a child among them, and now a family, refusing to surrender what many believed was the source of their misfortune. Fear hardened into conviction. If the Calders would not part with the ring willingly, it must be taken from them. It began with a gathering after evening service at Reverend Morton's church. A handful of parishioners lingered long after the rest had departed, their conversation hushed but urgent. Some argued for mercy, others for action, until at last consensus emerged. They would go to the Calder home, not as supplicants this time, but as protectors of the community. They spoke of duty, of purging a danger that threatened not just one family but the entire neighborhood. When they set out, lanterns in hand, their number had swelled from 4 to nearly a dozen. The Calders heard them before they saw them. A crunch of boots in the snow, the low murmur of voices, the sudden knock at the door, not the polite rapping of neighbors, but the heavy insistence of men who expected compliance. Jonathan opened it, his merchant's composure cracking as he saw the crowd gathered on his threshold. Samuel appeared at his shoulder, jaw clenched, ready for confrontation. Behind them, the matriarch sat in her chair with the wooden box resting firmly in her lap, as though she had known this moment would one day arrive. The exchange was short, sharp, and without disguise. Reverend Morton spoke for the group, his breath visible in the cold air. "Jonathan Calder, we come not in malice, but in necessity. That object must be surrendered. It has brought sorrow upon your house and unease upon the city. By keeping it, you invite danger upon us all." He extended his hand, palm open, the gesture of demand softened by the posture of prayer. Samuel's response was immediate and furious. He declared that no man would rob them in daylight or darkness, that their grief was theirs alone, and that the ring would remain with the family, as long as blood still ran in their veins. Jonathan tried to temper his brother's fury, but the line was drawn. The crowd pressed forward, some calling for reason, others raising their voices with accusations, selfishness, pride, idolatry. What began as demand edged swiftly toward invasion. The moment of violence came suddenly. One man, perhaps emboldened by the group's numbers, tried to push past the threshold. Samuel struck him back with the iron poker he had kept since the attempted burglary, the blow glancing off the man's shoulder. Shouts erupted. The lantern light shook wildly in the snow. Some cried for restraint, but others surged forward, convinced now that the family would never yield. In the chaos, the matriarch rose. She held the wooden box tight to her chest, her thin frame trembling, yet her voice cutting through the din. "You will not have it. This ring is my daughter's, and none shall take her from me." Her words froze the crowd for a moment, as though grief itself had taken the form of defiance. But the reprieve was brief. The men pressed forward again, hands reaching not for coin or silver, but for the small box she guarded. At last, Jonathan forced the door shut against them, the wood shuddering under fists and shoulders. For several minutes, the crowd pounded, their demands mingling with threats. Then, as abruptly as they had come, they dispersed, leaving the Calders in silence broken only by the mother's sobs and Samuel's ragged breath. Outside, footprints trampled the snow into a record of the night's fury. Inside, the box remained intact, the ring untouched. The raid was not successful, but its meaning was clear. The community had crossed from persuasion into attempted seizure. The Calder home, once a place of mourning, was now a fortress under siege, and the family's loyalty to the ring had turned them into outcasts. The contrast had reached its starkest form. What the Calders considered an emblem of love, their neighbors saw as a contagion that had to be excised, even by force. And in that violent clash, the story of the ring passed from rumor into history, a tale etched not only in memory, but in scars left on doors, shoulders, and hearts. In the weeks following the failed raid, silence spread across Boston with an unnatural swiftness. The same voices that had thundered against the Calders in taverns and church pews now grew hushed, as if the attempt to seize the ring had broken not only trust, but also the will to continue the conflict. What could not be accomplished by force would not be spoken of in daylight. Even Reverend Morton, who had stood at the head of the crowd, avoided mention of the affair in his sermons, preferring parables of general sin over pointed accusations. A conspiracy of forgetting took shape, and with it a slow institutional burial. The city authorities, already reluctant to intervene in a family matter tinged with superstition, saw in the raid an embarrassment best erased. When one of the men struck by Samuel Calder attempted to file complaint, the constables declined to pursue it, citing lack of witnesses willing to testify. Records of the night's events, scribbled briefly in the parish log and in the neighborhood watch's notebook, were quietly redacted. Pages went missing. Entries were revised to refer only to a disturbance among households. In official archives, the siege never happened. Boston preferred to let the Calders remain an oddity, a cautionary tale whispered over hearths, rather than a scandal requiring adjudication. But the silence outside only deepened the isolation within. The Calder home became fortress-like, its shutters drawn even in daylight, its doors barred except to a handful of trusted kin. Samuel took to patrolling the property after dusk, poker still in hand, convinced another mob might return. Jonathan withdrew from business entirely. Creditors whispered of his losses, and soon his name vanished from merchant ledgers where it had once stood prominently. The matriarch grew frailer, clutching the box with such constancy that some swore she slept with it pressed against her chest. The family did not speak of surrender anymore. The ring had become not only symbol but sentence. Artifacts from this period reflect that shrinking inward turn. A surviving letter from a family acquaintance kept, it seems, but never answered. Pleads for reassurance after weeks without sight of the Calders in church. I fear you have withdrawn not only from us, but from Providence, the correspondent wrote. And I beg you return before shadows claim you. Entire, the letter is folded, with such sharp creases, it seems never to have been opened fully. Its presence in the archive is itself a contradiction, evidence of connection left unanswered, proof of silence more than speech. The contrast of this era is especially haunting. Outwardly, a neighborhood eager to forget, to smooth its conscience by erasing what it had attempted. Inwardly, a family dissolving under the weight of both grief and suspicion, bound to an object they could neither destroy nor release. Boston erased the Calder story from its official memory. But in doing so, it consigned the family to a kind of living tomb, walled off by silence rather than stone. This was the cost of the raid's failure, not just bruises and broken trust, but a deliberate suppression of history. What had been shouted became whispered. What had been whispered became unsaid, and what was unsaid festered in private. In that vacuum, the ring's legend grew all the stronger, carried forward not by documents but by absence, by the eerie knowledge that something had been carefully hidden. What remains of the Calder story after the silence of 1852 is not a continuous chronicle but a scatter of fragments, fragile and contradictory, like shards of a vessel once whole. These are not the public records, for those were deliberately thinned and scrubbed, but private relics discovered, piecemeal, an attic box unearthed during an estate sale in 1893, a folded journal page tucked into a lawyer's folio, marginalia in a parish Bible. Together, they form a mosaic that is incomplete yet strangely luminous, offering glimpses of what the family endured after the community turned its back. The most telling piece is a thin journal attributed to Jonathan, its leather cover warped by damp and its ink faded to a brittle brown. The entries are uneven, as though written in haste or under duress, but the handwriting is unmistakably his. He records debts unpaid, failed ventures, and then shifts abruptly into private lamentations. Our name is dirt in this city. Samuel burns with rage, mother withers, and still the box remains as a heart that will not cease its beating. He writes of hearing knocks at the window when no figure stood outside, of finding the shutters unlatched though he swore he had secured them, of dreams in which he saw the ring upon his own hand glowing as though it were molten. The journal stops without conclusion, mid-sentence, on a page where the ink blots into a spreading darkness. From Samuel no diary survives, but a single scrap of coded notation, strings of numbers and letters, arranged in columns. When first uncovered, antiquarians speculated it was a cipher, and later analysis suggested it may have been a form of substitution code, though not enough of the key remains to decode it fully. Among the few phrases discernible, one repeats with unsettling regularity, "Circle unbroken." Whether this was a reference to the ring, to family loyalty, or to a broader theological notion is unclear, but the repetition lends it the quality of an obsession. Even the matriarch left her trace, though hers is subtler still. On the inside cover of the Calder family Bible, faint pencil lines mark dates of deaths. Margaret, Eleanor, the Price child. Beside each she added notations. Ring present. The words are small, cramped, almost reluctant, yet their consistency suggests deliberate recording. To mark such a detail is to admit recognition of a pattern, though no explanation follows. If anything, these tiny notes are the most damning evidence of all, not rumor, not gossip, but the hand of the very woman who refused to part with the object. It is these fragments scattered across decades and contexts that bear witness to the Calder ordeal after the community chose erasure. Each is fragile, incomplete, easy to dismiss in isolation, yet together, they testify to a story Boston tried to bury. They reveal a family dwindling not only in number but in spirit, haunted by the object they clung to. Even as they recorded, sometimes consciously, sometimes perhaps despite themselves, that it was more than a simple heirloom. The contrast could not be sharper. Official silence versus private confession, absence of record versus survival of fragments. The city may have erased the Calder name from its annals, but the relics resisted, their survival accidental yet powerful. And it is through these pieces, the warped journal, the cipher scrap, the penciled notations, that later generations would reconstruct the shadow of what had happened, and the unsettling sense that the ring was more than a symbol, that it was, in its own way, a participant. The Calder story as it survives does not end with a resolution but with an unease that lingers. There is no final burial where the ring was interred, no decisive act of destruction, no public exoneration or condemnation. What remains are fragments, whispers, the afterimage of grief pressed into paper and wood. In that absence of conclusion lies its true power, for the Calder ring becomes less an artifact than a mirror, reflecting what a community fears, what a family clings to, and what the living will make of the dead when meaning cannot be neatly drawn. Objects have always carried weight beyond their material form. A ring is meant to symbolize unity, fidelity, endurance. But what happens when that symbol is drowned in funerals, when its passage from hand to hand no longer blesses but wounds? The Calder case demonstrates how a token of devotion can, under the pressure of repeated tragedy, transform into an emblem of doom. Was the ring cursed in any literal sense? History cannot answer. What it does show is that belief itself can turn metal into menace. A family bound themselves to an object out of loyalty, while their neighbors recoiled from it as contagion. Neither side possessed proof, but both lived and died by conviction. There is an ethical tension here that cannot be smoothed. The Calder matriarch refused to relinquish the ring because, to her, it was the last vessel of her daughter's presence. To take it from her would have been an act of cruelty. Yet the community, convinced the object drew death like iron to a lodestone, saw her refusal as selfish, even dangerous. Between those stances lies a chasm that could not be crossed. Grief is sanctuary, grief is threat. When institutions chose silence, when physicians' reports vanished and parish logs were cleansed, they did not settle the matter. They simply left it to echo unresolved. Today we inherit only that echo. The fragments preserved are not evidence of supernatural force but of human endurance. Jonathan's blotched words, Samuel's coded desperation, the mother's penciled acknowledgement that the ring was present each time the earth opened. These artifacts remind us that stories do not survive because they are tidy. They survive because they resist closure. The Calder family did not conquer their burden, nor did the city conquer its fear. What endures is the uneasy truth that memory itself is porous, and that grief, left unexamined, can calcify into legend. So the question is left to us, not whether the ring was cursed, but what it means that people believed it was. What does it say about the ways we project sorrow into objects? The ways we build prisons out of symbols we cannot bear to release? How many heirlooms in quiet drawers carry not joy but dread, their histories unspoken yet shaping the lives around them? In this, the Calder ring is less a relic of Boston than a mirror for us all. A reminder that memory clings to objects, and that the line between remembrance and haunting is thinner than we might wish. Perhaps the final burden is not the ring itself, but the stories we continue to tell about it. Stories that outlast the family, the neighborhood, even the city's official silence. The Calder narrative does not end so much as it dissipates, leaving behind fragments that refuse to align into a neat conclusion. Unlike the carefully recorded histories of Boston's mercantile families or the polished genealogies of its old congregations, the Calders trail off into obscurity. The absence is itself telling. No definitive record notes the fate of the wedding ring. It was not inventoried among estate documents, nor listed in auction catalogs, nor even passed down in any surviving will. It is as though the object slipped from history, or was deliberately concealed in a gesture of refusal. That disappearance is not a resolution, it is a haunting. Objects bear meanings larger than their weight. A band of gold is, in the eyes of tradition, the most intimate of symbols: fidelity, unity, continuity. Yet the Calder case reminds us that symbols are never stable. The very ring that was meant to bind generations together instead came to signify rupture. Funerals followed its circulation. Suspicion surrounded its presence, and even its defenders came to mark its appearances in hushed notations. Was the ring cursed in the supernatural sense? History provides no such certainty. But it was cursed in another sense, through repetition, through the way grief adhered to it until it could no longer be seen as neutral. Belief itself, sustained and sharpened by loss, became the agent of its transformation. The family, in holding fast, enacted both love and ruin. The matriarch's refusal to surrender. The ring was not stubbornness alone, but an act of devotion, a clinging to her daughter's memory in the only tangible form left. To remove it from her possession would have been, in her eyes, a second burial, an erasure of intimacy. Yet to the community beyond those shuttered windows, her devotion became danger, her loyalty reinterpreted as selfishness. This is the paradox that makes the Calder account so unsettling. Grief as sanctuary within one household, grief as contagion in the eyes of the city. Institutions chose silence, and that silence became complicity. Physicians withdrew their petitions, clergymen ceased their warnings, constables closed their ledgers. By doing so, they did not settle the matter but allowed it to become legend, leaving the burden to rumor and the record to fragments. In that void, interpretation flourished. A blotched line in Jonathan's journal became a prophecy. Samuel's cipher grew into evidence of obsession. The penciled notations in the family Bible took on a significance their author may never have intended. Where there is no official history, myth rushes in to fill the absence. And so the Calder story endures, not because it provides proof, but because it offers a mirror. It reflects our uneasy relationship with the past, with grief, and with the objects we cannot release. How many families, in silence and secrecy, keep heirlooms whose meaning is darker than they will admit? How many rings, letters, or relics are preserved, not out of joy but because to discard them would feel like a betrayal of memory? The Calder case forces us to consider whether memory itself can become a kind of haunting, and whether the objects we revere can quietly master us. Perhaps the ring's power was never in its metal, but in the weight of the stories affixed to it. If so, then its disappearance is less a relief than a continuation, its story unfinished, its influence surviving precisely because it cannot be neatly closed. And so the final question lingers, unresolved, a challenge across the century. If such an heirloom came into your keeping, beautiful in form, burdened in history, would you guard it as a vessel of love, or abandon it as a vessel of dread? The choice is as much about the living as it is about the dead, and in making it, we reveal what kind of weight we are willing to carry.